Imagine a country that, by all logic, should be almost empty. A country where nearly all the land is desert. A country where endless sand stretches in every direction, where rain is rare, where the sun burns the ground, and where life should be scattered, fragile, and limited to a few isolated oases. And yet more than 100 million people live here. There are giant cities here. Farms, factories, highways, ports, apartment blocks, mosques, universities, and crowded neighborhoods full of life. There are some of the most famous monuments in human history. There's one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. There is Cairo, one of the largest cities on the planet. All of this exists in a land that should, in theory, be almost unlivable. This is Egypt, a country that shouldn't exist without one river. And the most astonishing thing is not that the Nile gave Egypt life in the past. The most astonishing thing is that it still does. Today we're going to find out why almost all of Egypt lives on one thin, green strip of land, why the Nile made one of the greatest civilizations in history possible, why the rest of the country remains overwhelmingly empty, how modern Egypt became dangerously dependent on a single river, and why the future of this ancient land may depend more than ever on water it does not fully control. To understand Egypt, you first have to understand how extreme it really is. Because when people imagine Egypt, they often picture pyramids, camels, temples, and the Nile flowing calmly through a timeless landscape. But the truth is much harsher. Egypt is, above all, a desert country. The overwhelming majority of its territory is part of the Sahara. Vast areas of the country are dry, rocky, sandy, and unforgiving. Rainfall is minimal across most of Egypt. In many places, a proper rainstorm is not a seasonal event. It is a rarity. This means that almost none of Egypt can support large-scale life on its own. There are no broad rainy plains covering the country, no giant fertile heartland spread evenly across the map, no dense network of rivers crisscrossing the land, no natural abundance of fresh water across the desert. Without the Nile, Egypt would be little more than scattered desert settlements, a few oases, and a long, difficult coastline. The Nile is what changes everything. It flows from far to the south, carrying life into one of the driest regions on Earth. As it moves northward toward the Mediterranean, it cuts through the desert like a green artery. Along its banks, the land becomes fertile. Crops can grow, settlements can survive. Cities can rise. That is why Egypt looks so strange from above. If you see it on a map or from a satellite, the country seems almost unreal. There is endless beige desert everywhere, and then suddenly a narrow ribbon of green cutting through it. At the north, that ribbon opens into the Nile Delta, a triangular fan of fertile land spreading toward the sea. That green ribbon is Egypt. The rest is mostly desert. This is one of the sharpest contrasts in the world between habitable land and empty land. In many countries, people are spread across a wide territory. In Egypt, they're crowded into a tiny share of the map. Most Egyptians live either along the Nile Valley or in the Nile Delta. In other words, the country lives on the river. This pattern is not new. It is ancient, long before modern Egypt existed. The Nile was already shaping human destiny here. Every year in ancient times, the river flooded. Those floods were not merely destructive. They were the foundation of civilization. As the flood waters spread, they left behind rich silt, dark, fertile soil that renewed the land again and again. That is why the ancient Egyptians called their fertile land the Black Land, in contrast to the surrounding red land of the desert. The desert was death. The river was life. This annual cycle made agriculture possible on a remarkable scale. Farmers could grow grain, support large populations, feed workers, support cities, and create surpluses. And surplus is what makes civilization possible. It allows rulers, priests, builders, scribes, soldiers, artisans, and entire state systems to exist. Without agricultural surplus, there are no pyramids. Without reliable harvests, There is no ancient state without the Nile. There is no pharaonic Egypt. The river did not merely help Egypt. It created it. That is why one of the oldest truths ever written about this land is still one of the simplest. Egypt is the gift of the Nile, and that is not poetic exaggeration, it is geographic fact. Ancient Egypt became powerful not because it had endless land, but because it had a narrow, reliable corridor of fertility in a region where that was incredibly rare. The Nile gave food, water, transport, and a natural access for organizing the country from south to north. That last part matters a lot. The river was not only for farming, it was also a highway. In a desert world where crossing land was hard, the Nile connected settlements. Boats could move goods, people, stone, grain, troops, and ideas. The river tied Egypt together, so the Nile did four things at once. It fed the land, it watered the people, it connected the settlements, and it gave the state a spine. That is why so much of Egyptian history happened where it did. Temples, capitals, tombs, and cities appeared not randomly, but along this corridor of life. Even the Great Pyramids, standing near the edge of the desert, are close to the strip of life the Nile made possible. The desert and the river worked together in a strange way. The river gave Egypt life. The desert helped protect it. Invading large desert spaces was difficult. The emptiness around the fertile core acted like a buffer. So ancient Egypt was concentrated, vulnerable in some ways, but also unusually coherent. It had a clear center because nature itself forced people into that center, and in many ways, modern Egypt still follows the same pattern. That is what makes the country so extraordinary. Thousands of years passed, kingdoms rose and fell. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, the British, and modern states all came and went. Technology transformed the world. Populations exploded. Cities became megacities, and still Egypt remains tied to the same river. Cairo is the clearest proof of that. Today. Greater Cairo is one of the biggest urban agglomerations on Earth. Tens of millions of people live in and around it. It is noisy, crowded, massive, chaotic, and intensely alive. It is the political, cultural, and economic heart of Egypt. And it exists because of the Nile. Cairo is not in the middle of a broad green country. It is essentially attached to the river system that supports the country. It lies near the place where the Nile Valley opens into the delta, one of the best possible positions in Egypt for life, trade, government, and agriculture. That is why Cairo became so powerful. It sits where Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, river transport, fertile land, and political control all come together. But here the story starts to become more complicated. Because what was once a strength can also become a trap. The same geography that made Egypt possible also limits it. The country depends on an extremely narrow habitable zone. That means population growth creates enormous pressure. Egypt's population has exploded over the last century. The number of people needing water, food, housing, electricity, transport, and jobs has risen dramatically, but the Nile has not magically expanded. The green strip is still narrow. The delta is still finite. The desert is still desert. This creates one of modern Egypt's deepest problems, to many people depending on too little fertile land and too little fresh water. That pressure is visible everywhere. Farms are divided and subdivided. Cities spread over old agricultural land. New housing pushes into the edges of the fertile zone. Villages grow denser. Roads, factories, and urban sprawl eat away at farmland that took the Nile thousands of years to create. Egypt is trying to fit a modern mass society into a landscape designed by one river, and that is incredibly hard. This is why the desert is so central to Egypt's modern ambitions. Again and again, Egyptian leaders have dreamed of pushing people outward, away from the overcrowded Nile corridor and into the surrounding desert. New cities have been planned, desert developments have been promoted. Highways and satellite towns have been built. Even Egypt's huge new administrative capital east of Cairo is part of this same logic: relieve pressure on the old core by expanding into the desert. But this dream keeps running into the same problem. The desert still has to be supplied. You can build cities in the desert, but you still need water. You still need infrastructure. You still need transport, electricity, schools, jobs, and daily life. And in Egypt, all roads eventually lead back to the same question: where does the water come from? That is the brutal reality of the country. Egypt is not simply short of land, it is short of usable land. A huge difference. A map may show a large state, but if almost all of that land is dry and hostile, then the practical country is much smaller than the official one. That is why Egypt feels crowded. In a way that can surprise outsiders, the country is large, but the livable core is narrow. The result is compression, millions of people packed into a thin ribbon of life. And all of that depends on a single river. That river is not just important for drinking and farming, it is also deeply tied to Egypt's modern energy and water systems. Perhaps the single most important modern symbol of this is the Aswan High Dam. If ancient Egypt depended on the natural rhythm of the Nile, modern Egypt tried to control it. The Aswan High Dam, completed in the 20th century, was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the country's history. It created Lake Nasser, one of the largest artificial reservoirs in the world, and gave Egypt a way to regulate floods, store water, and generate hydroelectric power. In one sense, this was a triumph. The dam reduced the risk of devastating floods. It helped smooth out the river's seasonal extremes. It made water management more predictable. It generated electricity. It became a symbol of modern Egyptian state power, but like many giant engineering solutions, it also came with trade-offs. Before the dam, the Nile's annual floods brought fresh silt naturally onto fields. After the dam, that sediment was increasingly trapped upstream. Farmers became more reliant on artificial fertilizers. Water management became less about living with the river's natural cycle and more about managing a controlled system. Egypt gained control, but it also became more dependent on maintaining that control. This is a pattern we've seen before in other countries. The Netherlands survives by keeping water out with pumps, barriers, and constant maintenance. Egypt survives by managing one river with dams, canals, and distribution systems. In both cases, nature was never truly defeated, it was organized. And that means the system must keep working. If the Nile is Egypt's life, then controlling its flow is now part of Egypt's national survival. But here comes the next problem. Egypt does not control the entire Nile. This is one of the most important and uncomfortable facts about the country. The river may define Egypt, but most of its water comes from beyond Egypt's borders. That means Egypt's future depends not only on rain, climate, and engineering, but also on upstream politics. The Nile is an international river. What happens in countries farther south matters enormously. If upstream nations store more water, divert more water, or build their own large systems, Egypt pays close attention because even small shifts can have massive consequences for a country so dependent on one source. This is why disputes over Nile waters have become such a major issue in recent years, especially around Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. For Ethiopia, such a project represents development, energy, and national ambition. For Egypt, it raises fears about long-term water security. And that shows how fragile Egypt's position really is. A country of more than 100 million people depends on a river that begins far beyond its own territory. That is strategic vulnerability on an enormous scale, and if that were not enough, Egypt now faces the pressures of climate change. This matters in several different ways. First, higher temperatures increase evaporation and water stress. Second, Changing rainfall patterns upstream can affect how predictable the Nile remains. Third, the Nile Delta is threatened by sea level rise. That last point is especially dangerous. The delta is one of the most fertile and densely populated parts of Egypt. It is a low-lying region where farming, towns, infrastructure, and millions of lives are concentrated. If sea levels rise and salt water pushes farther inland, the delta could face erosion, land loss, and salinization of soil and groundwater. In simple terms, the sea could begin to damage the very land that feeds Egypt, and that would be devastating because Egypt does not have a second Nile. It does not have another great fertile basin waiting elsewhere. If the delta weakens and the valley becomes more crowded, the whole national system comes under pressure. This is why Egypt's water story is not only about the past, it is about the future, and that future looks increasingly tense. Population grows, demand rises, climate pressure increases, farmland is strained. Water is contested, the desert does not get any kinder, and the country remains tied to one river. At the same time, Egypt is not helpless. That is important to say clearly. Egypt has spent decades trying to expand irrigation, improve water use, build new communities, and reduce the pressure on the old core. Massive projects have tried to reclaim desert land, build new roads, and create new urban centers. Some have worked better than others, but all of them reflect the same truth. Egypt understands it cannot simply keep squeezing more life into the same thin strip forever. Still, this is much easier to say than to do because geography is stubborn. The Nile Valley and Delta are not just where Egyptians live, they are where Egypt makes sense. That is where the best land is. That is where history accumulated. That is where institutions, markets, roads, and cities grew. That is where the great population centers already exist. You can build outward into the desert, but you cannot move the heart of Egypt easily. This is what makes the country so fascinating. It is both ancient and intensely modern in its problems. In one sense, Egypt still lives by the same geographic rule that shaped the pyramids. In another, it faces the 21st century version of that rule. How does a massive modern nation survive when almost all of its life depends on one increasingly stressed river system? That is the real question. And it also destroys some common myths. The first myth is that Egypt is simply a desert country, as if the whole story ends there. Yes, most of the land is desert, but Egypt is not defined only by emptiness. It is defined by concentration. The country is not interesting because it is empty. It is interesting because almost all life is forced into such a narrow space. The second myth is that the Nile is just a historical symbol. It is much more than that. The Nile is not only the river of pharaohs and old temples. It is the river of modern apartment blocks, irrigation systems, industrial growth, hydroelectric planning, and national vulnerability. It is as important now as it was in ancient times, just in different ways. The third myth is that the desert around Egypt is simply unused space, waiting for development. That is far too simple. Desert is not blank land, it is harsh land. To turn desert into productive living space requires water, infrastructure, money, and maintenance. You are not just expanding, you are fighting the geography of one of the driest environments on Earth, and the geography pushes back. That is why even today, when Egypt builds dramatic new projects in the desert, those projects still depend on systems connected to the Nile and the old populated core. The river remains the anchor. There is also a deeper historical irony here. Ancient Egypt became one of the world's earliest great civilizations because the Nile gave it a rare combination of fertility and order in the middle of a desert world. Modern Egypt remains one of the Arab world's most important countries for almost exactly the same reason. The river created the core. The core created the state created the civilization, and everything around it remained harsh enough to keep reminding the country where its real limits were. This is not unlike what we saw in the Netherlands. Except in reverse, the Dutch built their survival by keeping water away from their land. Egypt built its survival by staying as close as possible to water in a sea of land that could not support life. The Netherlands fears too much water. Egypt fears too little, but both countries show the same principle. Geography can dominate a nation for thousands of years. And Egypt may be one of the clearest examples on Earth because so much of its fate comes down to one simple truth. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt, not the Egypt of the pharaohs. Not the Egypt of Cairo, not the Egypt of millions of farmers, not the Egypt of crowded cities, bread subsidies, irrigation canals, and national politics, not the Egypt we know at all. The country's civilization, population, agriculture, and state power were all concentrated by one river cutting through one desert. That is a miracle of geography, but it is also a form of dependence, and dependence becomes dangerous when the system is under stress. That is why the future of Egypt matters so much. If water grows scarcer, the pressure on society grows. If farmland shrinks, food pressure grows. If the delta becomes more vulnerable, millions become more exposed. If upstream tensions rise, national anxiety rises. If the population keeps increasing while the livable corridor stays narrow, the whole country becomes more compressed. Egypt is not collapsing, but it is under pressure. And that pressure is structural. It comes from the land itself. Or rather, from the fact that almost all the useful land lies along one river, in a strange way. Egypt is one of the purest examples of how a country can be created by one natural feature and then spend the rest of its history trying to manage the consequences. The Nile gave Egypt life. Now Egypt must make sure that life remains sustainable. That is not only an Egyptian story. It is a human story. It is about what happens when civilizations build themselves around a single environmental advantage and then discover that advantage is not infinite. Egypt shows us both the power and the danger of total dependence. The power is obvious. One river made one of the greatest civilizations on Earth possible. The danger is just as obvious. When one river carries everything, everything depends on what happens to that river. And yet Egypt continues. It continues because human beings are astonishingly good at building around narrow opportunities. They turned a desert corridor into a civilization. They turned floodplains into fields. They turned riverbanks into cities. They turned one green line through the Sahara into one of the most enduring centers of human life. That may be the most remarkable thing about Egypt. Not the pyramids, not the pharaohs. Not even the river itself, but the sheer scale of life that people built on top of one fragile geographic gift. Egypt shouldn't exist without this river, and that is exactly why the Nile may be one of the most important rivers in human history. If you found this story interesting, like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories ahead about how countries survive where geography seems stronger than they are. See you next time.